The rain came down in thick, merciless sheets that Thursday afternoon, blurring the world into streaks of gray. Richard Langford slowed his luxury sedan near the gates of the prestigious Kensington Academy, his wipers struggling to keep pace with the storm. He'd been reviewing stock numbers on the dashboard screen when something unusual caught his eye. A small, unmoving figure on a park bench beneath a flickering street lamp. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the rain, but then a lightning flash illuminated the figure's outline, and his heart froze. That small silhouette, the narrow shoulders, the familiar tilt of the head. It was his 12-year-old daughter, Maya. He didn't remember pulling over. The car door flew open, and the roar of the rain swallowed the quiet hum of the engine. His polished shoes splashed into ankle-deep water as he ran toward her. "Maya!" he shouted through the downpour, his voice sharp with fear rather than anger. "What on earth are you doing out here?" She turned at the sound of his voice. Her hair clung to her face, her school uniform soaked and torn at the hem. In her trembling hands, she clutched half a sandwich wrapped in damp paper. When she recognized him, her expression flickered with guilt, as though she'd been caught breaking a secret rule. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered softly. Richard's chest tightened. He slipped off his expensive overcoat and wrapped it around her, shielding her from the cold. She was shivering uncontrollably. Her shoes, the ones he'd bought only a few weeks ago, were worn nearly through. "Why aren't you in school?" he asked, lowering his voice but unable to hide the edge of alarm. "And where's Mrs. Harris?" That name carried weight. Mrs. Helen Harris, his daughter's caretaker, the woman he trusted more than anyone to watch over Maya in his absence. Richard's business often pulled him away for long hours, sometimes days. But Mrs. Harris had always assured him that Maya was thriving, happy, and cared for. Maya hesitated. "She said you were on a business trip, and you didn't leave money for lunch this week." The words struck him harder than the rain. For a second, he simply stared at her, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "That can't be right," he said slowly. "I set up transfers every month, for your tuition, meals, everything." But the small voice that answered him carried only quiet resignation. "She said I shouldn't bother you with small things, that you're tired of spending money on me." Richard felt the breath leave his lungs. Tired of spending money on her? That was impossible. Maya was his world, his late wife's last gift to him. He knelt down despite the soaking pavement, his fine suit absorbing the cold rain. He gently lifted her chin until their eyes met. "You never need to hide anything from me," he said. "Tell me the truth. All of it." Maya's lips quivered. "Mrs. Harris said I'm not really your daughter. She said you only keep me because you feel guilty." The words tore through him like a blade. For an instant, he couldn't breathe. "Not really your daughter." The lie echoed in his skull, mingling with the drumming rain. He pulled Maya into his arms, wrapping her completely in his coat. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing quietly. Richard's mind was already racing. If Mrs. Harris had said these things, then she hadn't just neglected her duties. She'd been poisoning his child's heart with deliberate cruelty. When they finally reached home, the mansion loomed ahead, tall, beautiful, and suddenly foreign. The grand hall, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt like a hollow shell. Mrs. Harris greeted them at the door, her usual calm expression replaced with well-rehearsed concern. "Mr. Langford, thank heavens you found her. I was worried sick. She never came home from school." Richard's jaw tightened. He handed his daughter's wet backpack to a butler without looking away from her. "Where were you at 3:30? he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "At the market, preparing for your return from your trip," she replied smoothly. "You know how forgetful Maya can be." "Trip," he repeated, letting the word linger. "I haven't left the city all week." For a split second, her composure cracked, but she recovered quickly, smiling with faint embarrassment. "Oh, my mistake. I must have misunderstood." She reached to take Maya's coat, but Richard stopped her hand midway. "Bring me every receipt for Maya's school expenses," he said, his tone firm but even. "Today." Her eyes flicked toward the staircase. "They're upstairs, but perhaps tomorrow." "Now," he interrupted. There was no room for argument. Mrs. Harris hesitated, then turned sharply and descended the stairs, her steps a little too quick. Richard led Maya to the living room, draping a blanket around her trembling shoulders. She leaned against him, exhausted, and within minutes, she had fallen asleep. When he opened her backpack, his heart nearly broke. Torn notebooks, broken pencils, and a single crumpled note, written in his daughter's uneven hand. "Daddy doesn't want me anymore. Mrs. Harris said he'll send me away if I'm not good enough." By the time Mrs. Harris returned with a thin folder, Richard's face was unreadable, cold, calm, and razor-sharp. "Here you are," she said lightly, forcing a smile. "All expenses accounted for." He flipped through the papers. The receipts were recent and clearly forged. Dates didn't align, handwriting differed, and some bore the wrong school logo. "What happened to the records from last year?" he asked. "They were ruined, spilled coffee," she replied without missing a beat. "You've never spilled anything in this house," he said quietly. "Until now." Her mask slipped for an instant. A flicker of irritation crossed her face. And then, carelessly, arrogantly, she muttered under her breath, "I only did what was best for her. That child needs to learn the world isn't kind to kids like her." The statement hung heavy in the air. Richard's pulse thundered in his ears, but his voice remained measured. "Leave us," he said finally. She hesitated, then turned and walked away, her heels echoing through the marble hall. As the sound faded, Richard looked down at Maya, still asleep, small and fragile in his arms. His eyes hardened with resolve. He would uncover every lie, every secret, every betrayal. The woman who had dared to wound his daughter's spirit would regret the day she stepped into their lives. He reached for his phone and called a number he hadn't used in years. "Marcus," he said, his tone low and deliberate. "It's Richard. I need you to dig into someone. Her name's Helen Harris. Find everything she's hiding." Outside, the rain finally began to fade. But inside that grand, silent house, a different kind of storm had just begun. The following morning dawned clear and deceptively calm. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of the Langford estate, painting soft gold across the marble floors. But inside Richard's study, the air was sharp with tension. He sat at his desk, reviewing the preliminary report Marcus had sent overnight. The lines of text blurred as his anger deepened. Bank withdrawals, unaccounted cash transfers, and private purchases, all traced back to one woman, Helen Harris. She had been stealing from him for years. But what unsettled him most wasn't the money. It was the address Marcus had found on one of the invoices. A small, run-down property on the edge of town listed under a false name. The report ended with one note. "Possible location linked to child services file. You'll want to see this yourself." Richard's jaw tightened. He'd spent years trusting that woman with his daughter's life. Now he was beginning to see the full extent of her deceit. He looked up as Maya appeared at the doorway, clutching a stuffed toy rabbit, one he hadn't seen in years. Her voice was small. "Daddy, Mrs. Harris said I couldn't play in the East Wing. She said bad things happened there." Richard's pulse spiked. The East Wing hadn't been used since his wife's passing. No one had any reason to go there. He stood, forcing a smile. "You stay here, sweetheart. Daddy just needs to check something." He crossed the hall, the click of his shoes echoing through the empty corridor. Dust hung thick in the sunlight filtering through cracked blinds. He reached the end of the wing and turned the old brass knob. The door creaked open to reveal a storage room, boxes, forgotten furniture, and faint traces of cleaning supplies. But something was wrong. The floorboards near the back wall looked newer than the rest, freshly polished. He crouched down, tapping them lightly. Hollow. Richard's hand trembled as he pried up one of the boards. Beneath it lay a small compartment lined with velvet. Inside were several items: a jewelry box, a stack of envelopes, and a small, tattered photograph. He opened the envelopes first. Each one contained money, thick bundles of cash wrapped in rubber bands. Then he unfolded the photograph. His throat tightened. It showed Maya, smiling faintly, but behind her was a woman he didn't recognize. A stranger with tired eyes and a forced smile. On the back of the photo, in faint ink, were the words, "For when the truth finds her." He turned the jewelry box over in his hands and found a folded letter taped to its underside. The handwriting wasn't Helen's. It was elegant, feminine, familiar. He recognized it instantly. It was his late wife's. The letter read, "If anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll protect her from pity and from lies. There are people who would use her past to hurt her. Her birth mother loved her, but couldn't keep her safe. I never told you because I feared it would change how you looked at her. But she is yours, Richard, by heart, by love, and by every promise we ever made." His breath caught in his chest. The truth, long buried beneath silence, struck him like thunder. Maya wasn't his biological daughter, but she had always been his child in every way that mattered. And somehow, Helen had discovered this secret. She had twisted it, weaponized it, to turn Maya against him. Footsteps echoed in the hallway behind him. Richard turned sharply. Helen stood in the doorway, her expression calm, but her eyes cold. "I see you found it," she said quietly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard rose, the letter trembling in his fist. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," she replied. "Long enough to know the truth you were too proud to admit. She's not your blood, Richard. And deep down, you've always known it." He stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You had no right to tell her that. No right to poison her mind." Helen's smirk was faint, cruel. "I didn't poison her. I freed her. You built her life on a lie. Did you really think she'd never learn?" He could feel his control slipping, but he kept his tone measured. "You used a child to punish me." "Why?" Helen hesitated, her mask cracking just enough for the truth to show through. "Because people like you never pay for what you take," she hissed. "My sister worked in your factory. She begged for better conditions, got fired for it. 2 months later, she was gone. Your company buried her story, just like you buried the truth about that girl." Richard's breath stilled. The name Harris flickered somewhere in his memory, but he couldn't place it. "You came here to get revenge," he said slowly. "I came here to remind you that pain doesn't disappear just because you have money to hide it behind." She spat. "And when I saw how much you adored that little girl, I realized I could hurt you in a way no lawsuit ever could." Richard took a step forward. "So you hurt her instead." Helen's eyes flashed. "She's strong. Stronger than you think. She deserves to know what kind of man raised her." "That's where you're wrong," he said, his voice trembling with restrained fury. "She deserves to know what kind of woman tried to break her." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. "You're done here, Mrs. Harris. The police will be here soon." Her eyes widened. "You think anyone will believe you? You'll ruin your perfect image. Philanthropist hides adopted child's past. That'll be quite the headline." He stared at her, unflinching. "If protecting my daughter costs me my image, then let it burn." For the first time, Helen faltered. Her lips parted, but no words came. Then, without warning, she lunged for the box on the floor, snatching the cash and photo before he could stop her. She turned and fled down the corridor, her shoes slamming against the floor. Richard gave chase, his footsteps echoing through the house. By the time he reached the foyer, she was gone, the front door left swinging open, rain beginning to fall again outside. He stood there for a long time, chest heaving, the letter still clutched in his hand. The truth had cost him everything: peace, trust, and the illusion of safety. But it had also given him clarity. He knew now that he had one final thing left to do: rebuild the bond Helen had tried to destroy. Later that night, he found Maya sitting in her room, staring at the rain outside her window. The stuffed rabbit sat on her lap, its fur damp from tears. He knelt beside her, placing the letter gently in her hands. "I found something your mother wrote," he said softly. "She wanted you to know how much you're loved. By both of us." Maya looked up at him, her eyes searching. "So, what Mrs. Harris said was true. You're not my real dad." He swallowed hard. "Maybe not by blood," he whispered, "but love doesn't need proof. I chose you the moment I held you, and I'll keep choosing you every day after this." She didn't respond immediately. Then she reached forward and hugged him, tight, fierce, and full of unspoken forgiveness. For the first time in years, Richard felt something shift inside him. The weight he'd carried, the fear, the guilt, the lies, began to lift. Outside, the rain softened to a quiet drizzle, and in that stillness, father and daughter sat together, holding the truth and the pain it carried, but also the unbreakable love that survived it. Days passed, and the storm outside the Langford mansion mirrored the one inside. Reporters had begun circling the story, like vultures. Someone had leaked parts of it to the press, about the caretaker, the missing funds, and a child, hidden by a millionaire. Richard didn't care about the headlines. He cared only about the fragile silence that now filled his home. Maya had stopped asking questions. She moved quietly through the halls, eating little, speaking less. The spark that once lived in her eyes seemed dimmed. Every time Richard tried to bridge the gap, she smiled softly but distantly, as though trying to protect him from her disappointment. It tore him apart. One evening, he found her sitting on the staircase, staring at a framed photograph of her and her late mother. The woman who had taken her in, loved her, raised her as her own. Richard approached quietly and sat beside her. "I miss her," Maya said finally, her voice barely audible. "I do too," he whispered. "Every day." She looked up at him then, eyes glistening with something he hadn't seen before, not anger, but fear. "Do you think she'd still love me if she knew I wasn't really her daughter?" Richard's heart broke cleanly in two. He placed a hand gently over hers. "She already knew, Maya," he said. "Your mother knew from the very beginning. And she loved you not in spite of it, but because of it. You gave her a reason to live when she was losing everything else. You gave both of us that." The tears came quietly this time. She leaned against him, her small frame trembling. He held her, his chin resting lightly on her hair, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of peace returning. But peace was short-lived. 2 nights later, the doorbell rang after midnight. Richard opened the door to find a police officer standing in the rain. "Mr. Langford," the man said, "we've found Helen Harris." Richard's stomach turned. "She was caught trying to withdraw a large sum from one of your company accounts," the officer explained. "She claims she has proof that you falsified adoption documents. She's demanding a deal." Richard's expression didn't change. "What kind of proof?" The officer hesitated. "A recording. She said you paid off the birth mother." It was a lie, but a clever one. Richard agreed to meet with the authorities the next morning, determined to end this once and for all. But that night, as he sat alone in his study, he felt the old doubts return, the kind he hadn't felt since his wife's passing. Had he done enough? Had he failed Maya in ways even he couldn't see? He picked up the framed photo of the three of them, his wife's gentle smile, Maya's bright eyes, his own awkward grin, and whispered, "I won't let her destroy us." The next morning, the police escorted Helen into the interrogation room. Her wrists were cuffed, but her gaze was as sharp and defiant as ever. "Well," she said coolly, "the great Richard Langford finally meets me without his fortune to hide behind." He sat across from her, composed. "You lied to a child. You stole from her. And you think I'm the villain?" Helen leaned forward, smirking. "You think money makes you good? You and your kind always pretend you can fix pain by throwing bills at it. But you can't buy the truth." Richard's eyes darkened. "No, but I can prove it." He nodded to the officer beside him, who slid a small recorder across the table. "We recovered this from your property," the officer said. "You might want to listen." He pressed play. A faint hum filled the air, followed by Helen's voice, calm, cold, unmistakable. "He'll never look at her the same once he knows. That's the only way to make him hurt. Take the photo, the cash, burn the rest. If she cries, let her. It'll make the story more believable." Helen's expression faltered. "That's not." But Richard was already standing. "You built your revenge on the suffering of a child. My daughter." For the first time, her voice wavered. "She was never yours." Richard leaned forward, eyes blazing. "She is mine. Maybe not by blood, but by every sleepless night, every scraped knee, every story I told her when she was too scared to sleep. That's what makes a parent, not DNA love." Helen said nothing. Her confidence cracked completely. As the officers led her away, Richard didn't feel triumph, only sorrow. She had wasted her life chasing vengeance, while the one thing he'd been fighting for all along had been something she'd never known: peace. That evening, he returned home to find Maya waiting in the living room. She was holding the same letter her mother had written. Her voice trembled. "I read it again," she said. I understand now. She wasn't scared that I'd find out. She was scared that you would stop loving me if I did." He smiled gently. "Your mother knew me better than that." Maya looked down. "I'm sorry for believing Mrs. Harris. I thought maybe she was telling the truth." He knelt in front of her. "The truth can be cruel when it's twisted by hate. What matters is that you found your way back to it." She reached out and took his hand. "Can we go see Mom tomorrow? The place with the oak tree?" Richard nodded. "Of course." The next day, the sun rose clear and soft over the hill where his wife rested. The air smelled of wildflowers and rain-soaked earth. Richard and Maya stood in quiet reverence before the simple white stone. He placed fresh lilies at the base and whispered, "We're okay now." Maya knelt beside him, tracing her fingers along the carved name. "I wish she could see us." Richard looked at her, eyes warm with pride. "She can. Every time you smile, every time you're kind, every time you choose to forgive, she's right here." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind through the trees. Then Maya turned to him, her expression brighter, stronger. "Daddy," she said softly, "can we go for ice cream after this? The place with the pink chairs?" He laughed, a deep, honest laugh that felt almost foreign after so much pain. "I thought you'd never ask." As they walked down the hill, the sunlight caught the edge of the marble stone, making it gleam. For the first time in what felt like years, the world looked alive again. The storm had passed, and though the scars of betrayal would take time to fade, the bond between father and daughter had survived, proven not by blood, but by the quiet power of love and forgiveness. Cinematic closing voiceover, optional for your one-image video. Some truths break us, others rebuild us. In the end, love isn't about where we come from. It's about who never stops choosing us, even when the world tries to pull us apart.